Hello, travelers. Welcome to Reach the World. For over 20 years, Reach the World has used virtual exchange to inspire youth to become curious, confident, and compassionate global citizens. My name is Tim, and this week, together with Citi's E for Education campaign, we're going on a journey to explore how global citizens can put that valuable skill set to work as part of a global career. Over the course of 5 days, we'll be connecting with Citi employees in 9 financial capitals across 6 continents. They have generously agreed to share their stories, observations, and tips for finding success in this highly interconnected global economy. For a complete listing of upcoming Citi Global Career Journey live stream events, check out athome.reachtheworld.org. Today, we're continuing the Citi Global Career Journey with a stop in Dublin, Ireland, to speak with Citi employee Paul O'Reilly. Paul has been an amazing Citi Local Host to Reach the World travelers in Dublin in the past, and he's joining us virtually today to talk about working, living, and thriving professionally in Dublin. Before we meet Paul, though, I want to welcome the teachers, students, Reach the World travelers, and early career professionals who are watching this live stream today. Please use the YouTube chat bar to let us know you're here, where you're joining from, and to share any questions you have for our guests as we go. We'll get to as many questions as we can towards the end of this 45-minute live stream. All right, let's get underway. Paul, welcome to Reach the World.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. So nice to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. In the past, you welcomed Reach the World travelers to Citi's office in Dublin, and I want to thank you again for that. I know that was a great experience for them. Today, we get a chance to connect virtually to talk about your global career path and specifically about living and working in Dublin. So I want to dive right into it. The first topic I want to touch on today is you personally, you and your global career path. How did you start down the path of global citizenship? How did that turn into a career that demands global competency for success?
Yeah, I suppose to go back to where some of that began, or where that journey began for me. After I finished university, I did my primary degree and a master's degree, and as soon as I finished that, I took some time off and I went traveling, and I intended to travel around the world in about 12 months or so, and in practice I ended up taking about 18 months or so, and still never quite crossed off all the countries I intended on at the start. So I think you would spend a lot of time in university and working to accomplish that. So wanted to try and really branch out afterwards. So, that gave me a real taste. We traveled throughout Asia. We traveled down and spent a lot of time in a number of different countries. We went down then into Australia, to New Zealand, back through the US, through Europe. So, through that, it was really interesting to see a lot of different cultures where we hadn't been previously, and just expose ourselves maybe to life outside. And then when the chance came to move into the more professional environment and take my job, maybe on that one, Citi's been my only grown-up employer, let's say. It was my first job out of university, and partly why then that has worked. I joined Citi here in Dublin, and as the different roles I was fulfilling progressed, that was one of the things that was interesting to Citi about me at the start, that it was this big global institution, that I was familiar with the fact that it was present all around the world, and that I could join this institution in Ireland, in Dublin, where I was from, but that also would open up all of these other potential doors or potential pathways. I knew that Citi had offices in all of these different countries. So, as those as the career starts to develop and you become more exposed to different parts of the bank and different parts of the organization, you're constantly building on that network. So you're learning professionally, you're learning obviously the different items that it is that your role will encompass, but you're also building on that network of people, and you're starting to develop, to build that deck of contacts who you have in different countries, who are going to help you to learn whatever it is that you need to learn professionally, but also help you learn whatever you're going to need to learn to navigate that type of an ecosystem, or to navigate that type of an environment, because that becomes critically important, that you establish a support network and a learning network that will allow you to always learn more, to be able to be better at your job today, but also to understand about how do you get better at your job for tomorrow, or indeed what your job tomorrow is going to be. And a big benefit for me with Citi was exactly that as you grow and develop in those different areas, the roles that you're able to do also expand in that way. And through that, I initially started to travel to cover the various different clients and internal clients that I was dealing with from Dublin, so mainly around Europe. And then as part of that, I relocated. I moved to London to be based in London. It's quite some time ago now. So I moved roles fully to London, which then becomes a much bigger hub and a more central hub from the financial center standpoint. And then from there, your network grows again even further. That rather than being on one of the outside sites looking in towards a London or New York, you become operating in one of those big hub centers itself, which is then the center connected to all around the world. So as a result of that, you professionally, you will grow in whatever the task is, but that network that I spoke about at the start becomes exponentially larger as well, that you become exposed to all of the different countries and cultures who are similarly connected to London in that way. My travel remit also grew to become, regional and global, that I'd be, would travel further again around both the Citi network and our client network globally. Really interesting, it was always a really cool thing for me when being based in London was that it's such a diverse group of people geographically, that you're working on a floor of, depending on the department or the piece that you're working in, but there's thousands of employees in the office in London, and people coming from all over the world, all contributing. And it was always really, really interesting to get that breadth of knowledge or that breadth of background and experience, that everyone will come with a slightly different perspective or a slightly different cultural background that brings something else to the table to make, that helps you uncover the problem or think of an answer in a different way that you hadn't experienced or you hadn't thought of previously. So that's a huge benefit to the likes of that journey with Citi. And then ultimately, as generally happens, I started a family and wanted to move back toward a little bit closer to where my family and extended family was. So I was able to relocate back again to Ireland over the last number of years. So hence I'm back in Dublin in Ireland. But still today, I'm in the shed at the bottom of my garden at the moment, but have spent all morning on different Zoom calls, and for the last it's been 6 months or so of this, that there's been no physical traveling, but we speak to colleagues all around the world all day, which is somewhat strange considering I can look out the window into my back garden. But it's a really cool part of working for an organization like Citi, that that professionally, yes, of course, you can develop and work through into the various different fields, but that underlying network of people connected around the world is a really cool thing.
It's interesting to hear you say that this sort of all began with some early travels in your life. I think that's something that resonates with our audience quite a bit, because many of them are having initial or early abroad experiences and looking for ways to keep that energy going, keep that connection to this global economy going. I wonder if you always wanted to work in finance, if you studied finance, or if you sort of ended up in finance through a roundabout route.
Yeah, I definitely the latter. The roundabout routes was finance, or how I ended up in finance. I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do when I was coming to the end of my school to start university. And I did a dual degree. So my primary degree was a double degree. It takes a year longer. So I did a combined law and business degree because I couldn't make my mind up, basically. So I thought that was a good way to cover a couple of different bases. And then after that, I did a master's degree in business, so that kind of specialized me down that business route. I probably would have thought I'd have been more likely to go the legal route, but I think having done the initial legal qualifications, it was very interesting and challenging, and it's been really, really helpful from a thought process point of view, as in the time since I've left university. But I think I decided, or it became clear to me, that it wasn't something I wanted to work in on an ongoing career basis. And then following the period of travel, let's say, after that, I was quite exposed financially, let's put it that way. So I needed to get a good job with a reputable firm relatively quickly. So, Citi was, I was lucky enough to get an offer to go and work for Citi, which obviously ticked a huge amount of those boxes. But one of the big ones that I was thinking at the time was that, given the breadth of functionality that the bank has, there's a huge amount of scope, both professionally and geographically, for the different roles that you might take. And given I had a relatively broad background education wise at the start, it led quite well. So, I didn't have that. I absolutely want to get into finance and do exactly this piece of finance. I was much more a roundabout route. And I think maybe as well, I'd mentioned that, my path since joining the bank has also taken me through a number of different roles, which is great, that they all build upon each other. So, that core foundation of a good educational start point allows you to build on different blocks on top of that. And as you progress through your career, as you progress through life, there'll be other things that will become of interest or become a particular focus for a period of time. And it's great to always be able to layer in those experiences and build on that developmentally wise. Because then if you're in the right organization, maybe that does allow you to shift. You might take a lateral move into a different part of the organization or into a different focus. And that's something that I've been lucky enough to be able to do as well. I from working on trading floors and shouting and calling pricing and all of these types of things, to working much more on the business itself and us defining products, to working in the managing of a particular business within the bank as well. You build and layer on all of these different pieces of learning. And I think that's so important to always be pushing ahead with that. You keep growing that network and you keep growing professionally. It all helps to facilitate that.
Well, that's something you have in common with a lot of your Citi colleagues that we've talked to this week, who they maybe didn't study and go into college thinking they were going to be in finance, but through lots of different paths have ended up here. It's very interesting to hear your story. I want to switch over to talking specifically about living and working in Dublin, because it's such a unique city. Great Irish culture, just great all-around city, and you have a great dual perspective of having lived and worked in London too. Can you tell us a little bit about what you love about living and working in Dublin?
Yeah, I could probably disclaim it at the start. I'm from Dublin originally, so I'm always going to be maybe a little bit biased. But I think part of then another thing that, having grown up in Dublin, a lot of the things that happen in Dublin you take for granted, and you only really realize that when you spend a lot of time abroad or spend a lot of time in lots of different cities. And then all of those messages that you hear when people do visit Dublin and say, oh my gosh, this is, the way people say hello, or the way people talk, or that kind of underlying feeling if you go to a bar for a drink in Dublin or to a restaurant, a lot of that really starts to resonate. Whereas you don't, when you grow up here and you go somewhere else, you just expect everywhere else is a little bit like that as well. So, what does that feel like if you're here? Is that Dublin tends to be a very, very friendly place. People talk freely and easily. I hope I don't talk too much. It's that becomes part of it, that, Irish people in general and Dublin has this feel about it, that it's a very friendly and welcoming place to be. If you do have the ability, if you ever travel to Dublin or to Ireland, Céad Míle Fáilte is probably a sign that you would see in the airport. It's a Gaelic expression, and it's 100,000 welcomes is one of these kind of stock phrases that would be used. But I think the point is that idea of welcoming and friendliness and extending a hand or a conversation is quite a normal thing here, in a way that it might not be everywhere else. And that's only a benefit that you really come to understand or to really realize when you've spent a lot of time in other places. So that would probably be one of the big ones.
Great. What is your daily life like, your daily professional life like, an average day? Maybe not during a pandemic. Let's talk about pandemic aside.
Well, so generally my day will start. I have a couple of young kids, so that early portion of the day these days involves getting them to school. But then when I will go in, that there's that the idea of, my role heavily revolves around the markets and the financial markets, and specifically around foreign exchange. So FX trading and rates. So this is, different money. If you're in the US and you're going to travel to Ireland, for example, you're going to need to sell some dollars to buy some euros. It's our job to understand what the price is for those euros and dollars at any one time, for all the different currencies all around the world. So because of that, generally when we would come in the morning, it's trying to understand, right, what's happened overnight. My colleagues in Asia, and because these markets don't really close, so 5 days a week, they're going through the night, US evening, then it will get picked up by Asia first thing, and then Asia morning, and so on. So then, when we would come in London or here, early mornings, we'll come in, we'll speak to our colleagues in Asia about what's happened overnight. What have they been working on? Is there something that we need to then take over from them and work through the markets? And then we would help to try and feed and disseminate various information to different clients about what's been going on. We would have a range of different people who would rely on us for updates and information about whatever the particular thing of interest for them might be. Maybe it's an election going on in a particular country, excuse me. Maybe it's the pandemic is obviously having a huge impact on different country and different company finances. So it's trying to understand, is the value of one going to go up heavily versus another? And how do I help to try and, to transact around that? And then, again, it depends on the little pieces of the role, but generally it means that we'll be speaking to lots of people in lots of different countries. It tends to be fairly intense, which is something that was really attractive to me about it. It's something that we have lots of different types of communication that go on. Now obviously it's all going on here. What I mentioned earlier, the idea of open cry pricing and things, it's become so much more electronic over the last number of years that we will have chat rooms, we'll have little microphones that we can shout down. So you have voices and noises coming at you from lots of different places. That you get little different alerts on the machines depending on the types of trades or where they are. And you can get people shouting out of these different boxes looking for prices. So there's a constant barrage of information, I suppose, or of noises, and it's about trying to filter out what's going to be important or not, and what's going to be relevant or not, and then from a matter of prioritization, right, which ones do I really need to act on right now versus which ones can wait until maybe later today, or which ones can ultimately be delegated out to, how do we deal with that? So there's a lot of day-to-day firefighting going along, but then obviously there's a big strategic element about how do we steer the ship through those day-to-day storms, so that we're always going to be in the right position and come out where we want to end up.
It's really interesting to hear you say that the events and the things happening in places around the world impact your day-to-day life, and that you really need to understand what's happening around the world and how that works in the financial markets and in all, just sort of across all areas. How do you keep on top of all of that? It sounds like you talk to your colleagues in other countries, which is a great source of information. But do you read a lot of news? How do you stay so connected on a moment-to-moment basis with this big, complex world?
Yeah, I think, the first one that you mentioned, that idea around the network, and, I spoke about trying to build and develop that one early on. that's absolutely crucial, that no matter how much I could read on a news source or a platform or wherever that source may be, part of the benefit of working for an organization with Citi is that I have a colleague more than likely who's sitting right in the middle of that, who will be so plugged into that local situation, so I can just get on the phone or get on a chat and immediately speak to them and go, look, what's happening on the ground. Do I read a lot of news? Yes, absolutely. We try to, there's kind of international level news that you will read. Then there's the local level news here in Ireland, let's say, and then I still read a lot of the London news as well. And then work, so all of that work information stream tends to come from more of the kind of the business type channels. So the likes of Bloomberg and Reuters, let's say, are obviously big content providers. Where it starts to get really interesting then is when you read the different takes perhaps on similar stories across the different platforms, and that can become interesting to start to filter out your own views or your own opinions. And that's something that you notice particularly, I think, when you look at international level reporting versus super local level reporting. For example, in Ireland, we can see the stories that would be in the news here and how they're reported versus others. So yeah, to try and read as much news as you can, always being mindful of the sources, and trying to understand that, what is there an editorial position, and not to say that any is right or wrong, but just to understand that there's always going to be different inputs to those. So it's good to try and understand that, to read some different alternative sources as well, and try and inform yourself as to what's the real position. And that the thing we mentioned at the start, I'd probably just finish on that one. The idea of that network, being able to pick up the phone or to ask or to speak to somebody local, to be able to say, hey, and to maintain that network allows you to pick up the phone and make that call quite easily.
All right, great. I have a follow-up question to that, just because it's amazing to have at your fingertips this global network of people who can get you up to date on basically what you missed while you were sleeping, or what specifically is going on in a different place on the world. That concept of like picking up the phone and communicating with somebody in a different country, a different time zone, a different language perhaps, probably comes very naturally to someone like yourself who's been in a global career for a number of years at this point. Are there a certain set of skills that you have picked up over the years that make that such a natural and easy thing to do?
I think, natural and easy, I'm not so sure around that. I agree. It's a completely mind-blowingly cool thing to be able to do. And it's always been something that for me has been very gratifying, and something that I found really interesting. It was an aspect that I actively started to seek out roles within the bank that would allow me to build on that, and to, I was always curious what happened over there, and then once I figured out what happened over there, it was like, what happens a little bit further. So I think that idea of always pushing that boundary or asking that question will help to develop that or help to grow. In terms of skill set, things to help. I mean, languages is something that I guess most of the audience is going to be probably English speaking by nature, as am I. It's unbelievably impressive to be able to see people interacting comfortably across multiple languages. Growing up as an English native speaker, it means you get somewhat lazy, let's say, and most of my career I'll travel around and everybody will just slip comfortably into English. I studied a lot of languages in school, and I have very passable level other languages. Because we can get away without it, because everybody else will default to English. So if you have those language skills, keep practicing them. It's something that goes away very quickly if you don't. And it really helps to break down boundaries, if at all possible. If you can speak the local language, or at least demonstrate to make that effort, it can be really, really beneficial. Other than that, the thing, because that's not something I'm able to particularly do at all, but a really key skill or thing that will help is listening. That quite often, that we've learned our own experience, we've learned our own, what it is that we've learned, our own view, but always understanding that the other people in the room or on the end of the phone will likely be able to teach you things that you have no idea about, and you have to be open to hearing those messages. If you pick up the phone with a kind of a predetermined view on what the outcome of the call is going to be, or if you think you already know the solution, then what's the phone call really going to do? So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that always having an open mind, always being curious to what somebody else thinks, means that very often, and more often than not, the other people that you're interacting with will be able to teach you something. And there's things that they will know an awful lot more about than you. So you have to be able to listen and to hear when it's actually communicated, because too often it can slip through the cracks very easily if you're too firmly entrenched in what you're trying to say or in your own view.
That's some great advice. I have to go back quickly to what we were talking about in terms of language. We had a really great conversation recently with a Fulbright foreign language teaching assistant from Southern Ireland, who was telling us more about the Irish language and the popularity of speaking Irish within Ireland. First of all, did you learn Irish in school? I presume you did. And do you use it in your daily life or as part of your professional environment?
Did I do it in school? Yes. If you're born in Ireland, you have to, in order to get into university in Ireland, you have to have done, and you need to have passed Irish all the way through to your final stages. So yes, I studied in school for a long, long time. Am I any good at it? Not, unfortunately not. Do I use it professionally? No. From a professional capacity, Irish is a dual language here in Ireland, but it's a very, very small community of people who would use it as their day-to-day. Do I use it at all in my day-to-day life? My wife and I, obviously my young children are going to school now, so obviously they're learning Irish as well. So we try to use the Irish word or the Gaelic word for standard items, just dropping in little phrases and little words here and there, just to try to keep something possible. But I'm by no means fluent, unfortunately. That's a funny indictment of it, that I probably have better French and German than I do have of Irish, in a strange sort of way. So,
do you use your French and German professionally?
My German would have been more proficient, and if I'm traveling in Frankfurt, yes, I would try it, and at least have some of those initial chit chats. And similarly, French, I think when the conversation would revert to business, because it's been so long since I was actively, at one point I was very proficient in German. But once the conversation would start to get to technically professional, it's best for everybody if we just revert to English. But I think even to have that, that 5-minute conversation beforehand about, I studied French in school or German in school, it demonstrates a willingness to make an effort, a willingness to put yourself out there or to fail, which people will really value and appreciate. It's not an expectation that you would be able to speak any of the different languages and similarly the different cultures when you move around. This was something I experienced a lot in Asia. When you're traveling around, there's a lot of very different cultural norms and expectations that, it's not as if anyone is going to feel insulted if I get the bowing culture in Japan, for example. If I get that slightly wrong, it's not going to be considered as an insult. But me making an effort to try and be mindful of it, or to try to appreciate and understand it, always goes a long way. And I think languages are very similar.
That's some great advice. Thank you. We've already sort of segued into practical career advice for all of our viewers who are just getting started in their professions and are maybe coming off of a really exciting study abroad experience and looking for ways to incorporate their new global competencies into a job that makes global competency a real asset. I wonder if you could speak just a little bit more about what practical steps young people might be able to take now to make themselves a really strong job candidate for, an entry-level position or a position at Citi in Dublin.
Yeah. When the likes of, graduate positions are coming around, and we do a lot of grad recruitment, I used to be fairly involved in a lot of that program. I think, coming out of university, it was a piece of advice I got from one of my lecturers, and I think it was very valuable, was that to either subscribe to or to start reading some international level news. And I'm not going to tell you which one it should be, but just to try to elevate that level of understanding to a global, or at least a regional level, to try and understand a little bit about what's going on in the world is very important. Again, coming in as a graduate, you're not expected to be the finished product. You're not expected to come in and say, oh, now I can start to do it. All you're going to come in and all you're demonstrating is the fact that you have a really good attitude. You're really open to learning and to working hard. So, having that type of an international perspective about what's going on in the broader world will be really useful. I think having an idea about how you think the world is going to be moving forward. I mean, if you're thinking about a career in finance or in the bank, what do you think is going to change over the next 3 to 5 to 10 years in banking and finance for the role that you're going into? Are you able to add the different experience that you can see around you into a coherent view of what that might mean going forward is very important. So, I think in terms of that practical experience, one is to try and start reading about news or thinking about news on a more broad global level. And then the second one is attitude is absolutely critical. If you consider yourself the finished article, you're thinking of it in the wrong way. You're at you've achieved a great amount by finishing your college or your school career, but it's onto the next step of the journey. And moving into that graduate level career is that same type of thing. You're moving into the start of the next journey. And so you should view it that way. View it as an open opportunity to learn and to develop, rather than going in. I think it's a pitfall. I've seen a number of graduates come in and they were, telling me that this is exactly how it's all going to be because this is how I've learned it's going to be. Whereas it should be, look, I've done all of this to work. Where do we go from here? I have all these ideas. I'd love to learn more. I'd love to work hard. So attitude is absolutely critical.
All right, fantastic. I'm going to loop in a great question from our online audience today. We've had a big emphasis this week from talking to your colleagues around the world on networking and the value of networking, especially within a global community. Do you have any tips for your personal networking experience? How has that worked for you? Maybe you have an example of something that turned out unexpectedly or great through an effort in networking.
I think, some people, networking is something some people do very, very naturally and easily. Some people can maintain a huge web of contacts and friends in a way that some people work a lot harder at it. But either way, it's very important skill. I think a lot of probably today's generation would be much more familiar with the likes of social media, having grown up around that idea of an extended network of contacts. However, I think there's a huge difference between having an actual network of people that you're able to reach out to, ask a question and get a response and get a question back. You have to build a genuine relationship. And very often it's quite easy to maintain just that low level of simple things like just reaching out to say hello periodically. That, haven't thought of you in a while, or we haven't spoken in a while, just checking in, thought I'd say, hey. Simple things like that mean that whenever you do have the ask or there is the question, means that, there is still that contact established. And I would also think that, the very often it's unexpected sources or places that opportunity will come from. So, maybe this is the same type of point about keeping an open mind always and keeping an open network, and don't prejudge anyone or try to create a network with someone because you think they're going to be able to offer value, versus not working on a network with somebody because you can't see how they're going to be able to benefit you. It's the wrong approach or the wrong attitude. If you develop it from an open and genuine standpoint, then those opportunities or those conversations will come, because you're being yourself and you're being genuine and you're being open and you're being honest. And in the same way, if somebody is reaching out to you with a question or a query, or even that simple network that, look, hey, it would be great to learn a little bit about what you're doing or what you're working on, treat them in that very same way, because they'll be the people that you'll have to go to rely on for, help with whatever the fire is, or, maybe I'm interested in a new role and you are part of the world, or you are part of the bank. Can you give me some advice? Or have you heard of somebody who is hiring? If there's a genuine network there that you're able to pick up the phone and speak to somebody, or get a response when you look for it, that's the real thing. So maybe that piece of advice is understanding the difference between having, a set of contact names versus being able to actually speak to someone and get a response.
All right, fantastic advice. Thank you. I have another question from our online audience. The UK and Ireland are very popular study abroad locations for American students. And if you're studying or living in one place, you almost always visit or experience both as part of your time abroad. Could you explain what sort of the difference between, you're in a unique position to start to give us a hint at who would go searching for a job in London versus who might prefer to work in Dublin? Like, are there any differences that you can tell us that would guide someone who's considering both and isn't sure whether one or the other would be the best fit for them?
Yeah, both are incredible cities, but I would say they are very different. The main thing I would consider is the scale. London is a huge, huge city. And that's part of why it's an incredible place. It's the vibrancy in London and the energy in London is incredible. It is the center of the world for many of the, many industries, or, there's a very vibrant center in London for so many different pieces of business, be they creative businesses, be they finance, be they legal. London is London. And there's a reason why that expression actually makes sense when you're speaking about London. Aside, from that, just the place itself is stunningly beautiful with the history and the buildings. It's an incredible place to experience, but it depends where you're coming from. The fact that it's such a large city, I know a number of people who've been somewhat overwhelmed by that fact. If their background or their history maybe was from a much smaller location, that it can be a little bit too much. Traveling on the tube with thousands and thousands and thousands of people it can be somewhat intimidating if that's not something you're used to, or if it's not something you will enjoy. So Dublin is it's a much smaller place. So that would be something I would recommend. When Tim asked me about Dublin, and I noted that it was quite collegiate, let's say, it's a friendly place. I'm not saying that London is not a friendly place, but because it's so big, there's much less of that casual interaction in London than there would be in Dublin. Now, it could be then that you would find Dublin horribly laid back, or very parochial almost, because what you want is that full on, I'm in, the center of fashion, the center of a lot of tech and finance hubs. A lot of the fintech world is going on in London. Obviously, there's Canary Wharf and all the banks. So they'd be things I would consider. What is it that you're planning on getting out of university or getting out of your semester or your year, whatever it might be, and where would be your best fit?
All right, thank you. It's a great question, great answer. As our last question today from our online audience, you mentioned at one point really enjoying the energy of being connected to the world, that in some part at least of the world, it's always open and always changing. And when you wake up, something's new and there's something you need to adapt to. Are there any other specific skills that a young person might need to have in order to really thrive in that environment as well? Do you need to, I don't know, I don't want to plant any ideas, but is there anything that you can think of?
I would, and this is probably exactly the opposite to what the person is requesting. I think it's important to always have an ability to switch everything off. And what I'm getting toward here is an outside interest or a hobby. It doesn't matter what it is, it's that idea that, the last thing I would see at night or the first thing I would do in the morning, I'd be checking prices and all that type. It can be great, but it can be very difficult or very damaging mentally as well. And having the ability to switch all that off really helps you to be better at it. If you see what I'm trying to get at. So I think it's very, very useful to try and culture something that allows you to recharge your head or to switch your head. I mean, mine is pianos, for example. I've played pianos for years. I can sit down and lose myself for an hour or two playing the piano, and then all of the worries of the world effectively will go away. So, I'm not saying start learning the piano, but, tiddlywinks, cooking, reading, it doesn't matter what it is, but I think that's a really, really good thing that you will be able to, because, work is work. They call it work for a reason. So when you're there, it's going to be full on. And because you're so connected now, having the ability to be connected when you need to be, but then to be able to clear your head, whether it's going for a jog or playing a sport or music or whatever, I think that is a really important thing to develop.
I'm glad you brought up the piano, because I was going to have to ask you about it if you're a musician, given the background.
Like I said, I've played music from the time I could walk. So I've my actual piano's in the house. That's an old vintage piece of kit. I've just gotten out of storage recently. It took me years to find it. It's an old vintage organ. It's older than me. They don't make them anymore. So I was very pleased when I finally found it.
That's very cool. We have gotten through all the serious career business now, and I've finished with a really fun question for anyone who's watching today who has not been to Dublin, but it's near at the top of their list for when the world reopens and we can travel and explore more. What would you recommend they absolutely don't miss when they come to visit your city?
It's hard to look past, a pint of Guinness in O'Donoghue's, there's so, I'm not going to start listing the different places, but, I think, traditional music is a huge thing in Ireland. Guinness obviously is a very iconic part of Dublin. But just experiencing that, it's like I said, it's that type, if you go and have a pint of Guinness when there's a traditional music session going on, it becomes it's more difficult to not strike up a conversation with whoever is there than it is to strike up a conversation. And I think that type of experience is something that you take for granted here, but it is quite a cool thing if you're not familiar with it. So that's probably what I would pick. Try and find a proper traditional Irish pub and go and have something to eat and a drink, and you no doubt you'll get chatting to a stranger sitting next to you, and you get to learn something cool about where they're coming from or what their experience is, and go from there.
Oh, that's great advice. I'm beaming because I've had that experience and it's absolutely true. I can totally attest to what you're saying, Paul. Thank you so much for sharing your global career journey and these great insights on Dublin with Reach the World today. I want to thank you also to our entire on-camera and live stream audiences for the wonderful questions today. Reach the World Citi Global Career Journey continues this week with stops in Singapore, Sydney, Kampala, and more. How does living and working in those cities compare to what we just heard from Paul? I will be asking Citi employees in those cities the same questions in the coming days so we can make head-to-head comparisons and you can take the next steps on your personal global career journeys. Special thanks to the Citi E4Education campaign and all our many Citi volunteers like Paul around the world for making this experience possible. Check out the full lineup of upcoming events at athome.reachtheworld.org. We're off to Singapore next, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you very much, Paul.